Many theorists today have discovered serious deficiencies within liberal democratic forms of government, particularly in a globalizing world where governments are retreating within the national sphere and business is getting stronger, and governments find themselves in a position of playing off, if you like, against other governments for business investment. So the powerful social and economic forces that operate globally are encountering less powerful but nonetheless important countervailing forces that are coming together and coalescing around social issues, indigenous peoples issues, and environmental issues, and community concerns. This analysis of the problem, that the focus on the problem is fairly sort of agreed. There is a problem with liberal democracy, but the solutions that people come up with vary enormously. Some people want a form of cosmopolitan democracy, which really scales up the national democratic system to the global level. I find that very problematic. Others argue for deliberative democracy, in which there would be forums which would be much more discursive than current forums are. We have an adversarial rather than a deliberative system of democracy within the West at the moment. Other people focus on things like corporate social responsibility, and I myself, along with Ben Kishore and others, have done an enormous amount of work on certification and labeling as a form of new governance. So there's no lack of research going on in this field of trying to figure out what the problem is, on the one hand, with liberal democracy, and to seek solutions within that general framework. So this is not, in a sense, a radical, conceptualized, if you like, approach. It's not an anarchist approach. It's not even a Marxist approach. It accepts that liberal democracy is a starting point, but it argues that that is only the starting point. In some senses, we have to democratize liberal democracy. Well, where does this move us to? It moves us to this concept then, which I'm going to introduce, of good environmental governance, which builds on this good governance literature to some extent and on the environmental governance literature. Should I say at the outset, I know people are very upset with the World Bank and IMF, and probably, quite rightly so on a number of accounts. It is quite closely associated with the notion of good governance, but when you look closely at what the World Bank is getting at, they're really talking about good government. So even though they use the term, they're not actually referring to the concept as I would define it here. Nonetheless, there would be nothing wrong with good government in many of the third world countries that the World Bank focuses on. Once you analyze those countries, you realize that even a reasonable dose of liberal democracy would do them quite some good. A thicker definition and a more appropriate definition for governance, or for, if you like, good governance, comes from the Institute on Governance based in Ottawa, Canada. And you can see there that they list off a set of criteria of good governance: participation, transparency, responsiveness, consensus orientation, effectiveness, efficiency. And when you get into this literature on good governance, environmental governance, invariably this set of terms in some kind of combination comes up. And what I'm going to do is just build on that literature and identify 8 core terms that I think are critical for good environmental governance, and then use those to analyze the RPDC and PMAA process. But first, let's quickly refresh ourselves on the history of the RPDC process and the PMAA process, the PMAA process. Now, I've trailed through the literature on this, trying to get dates for the individual acts, and I'm presenting these more or less as facts, except where they are reported, in which case I accept them as reported facts rather than facts in themselves. You could say the process starts in June 2003, with the Premier reporting to have dined with Gunn's executive chairman, and a draft document passing hands relating to a pulp mill proposal. That's certainly a media report that we have on that. We do know that in November 2003, the Minister for Primary Industries, Water and Environment is requested, or requests the RPDC to review the Commonwealth's guidelines on new bleached eucalypt kraft pulp. I've put that date of November 2004 in purple because when we come to analyze aspects of the process, a key element in the analysis is, when does this process begin? It would be hard, I think, to make the case it begins in June 2003, but if you read some of the commentary on the pulp mill, it does seem that people do push the date back to around that time. On the other hand, it's hard to push it forward much beyond November 2004, because that, after all, is when it is declared a project of state significance, and the RPDC gets going on Gunn's draft project scope guidelines. Other things, of course, are going on at the same time. December 2004, Gunn's decides to sue 20 environmentalists. And in February 2005, it gets a report from Industry Edge, which is Robert Eastman, who regularly pops up in the media to comment on the pulp mill process. He's runs the consultancy Industry Edge, and it analyzes the global pulp market. So that report, which is critical, determines that Bell Bay is superior to Hampshire as a site for the pulp mill. And the reasons for it are almost exclusively economic. February 2005, we learn much later, we don't know this at the time, but we learn much later that Julian Green is having problems with the pulp mill task force. And this he claims is the first time he's intervened to tell them to back off. Of course, we only learned this in the early part of this year. In May 2005, crucially, the RPDC, having developed its draft scope guidelines, Gunn's submits a revised set of guidelines on the final day of public submission. This throws the process into disarray. Now, much has been made about the massive changes. I'm not sure that the changes were that massive, but they were certainly changes. And we learn now for the first time that it is to be elemental chlorine-free, not totally chlorine-free. It's going to have a much larger footprint on the Bell Bay site, and it's going to utilize some softwood. Up until then, it was going to use hardwood.